I'm with Tal Or from Cyberwell. Now, Tal, what is Cyberwell?
Cyberwell is the first real-time database of online anti-Semitism that's open to the public. We launched in May 2022. The database is available at app.cyberwell.org. And Cyberwell is a nonpartisan ethical nonprofit. We're using AI and open source intelligence techniques to create a real-time picture of the state of online anti-Semitism with the express mission of driving the enforcement and improvement of digital policy across social media platforms and sharing the data that we collect in the effort to fight anti-Semitism and hate.
You've seen an increase in anti-Semitism online since October the 7th.
Yeah, absolutely. Cyberwell saw since October 7th an explosion of online anti-Semitism. We tracked about 86% increase, so nearly a doubling of online anti-Semitism overall across the major social media platforms that we monitor. So that's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and what was once known as Twitter, today X. We're monitoring in both English and in Arabic. And what was markedly noticeable about the explosion in online anti-Semitism following the October 7th attacks was really this very clear shift into open calls for violence against Jews and Israelis, particularly in our Arabic data set following the October 7th attacks. This was also coupled with a new online iconicization or romanticization of Hitler. The hashtag Hitler was right went up by 1,600% in English and over 29,000% in Arabic, and the increased use of the romanticization of Hitler or the iconicization of Hitler in the Arabic online space specifically has been markedly noticeable since the October 7th attacks. And something that's interesting is that in addition to this shift in online anti-Semitism really taking a very violent turn, we also see the increase of what we call classic anti-Semitic narratives or religious-based anti-Semitic narratives in the weeks following October 7th. So across the online space, we had an increase of about 50% in the Jews killed Jesus conspiracy theory or blood libel. That specific content got a 50% increase, things that are not related directly to the conflict. So I think that's very much an indication that as we're experiencing this wave of online anti-Semitism that's very violent, and that is now taking its toll on Jewish communities across the world from kind of the left or Islamo-based anti-Semitism, especially because we're in an election year for the United States and for the UK. I think we may see a wave of also right-wing or religious-based anti-Semitism coming from the right. That's what the online data is showing us right now.
Are you able to actually approach some of these online platforms and get them to remove some of this anti-Semitism?
So Cyberwell, since our launch, was onboarded as a trusted partner, which is a specific status that is reserved for nonprofits working directly with social media platforms. So today, Cyberwell is a trusted partner of Meta, covering Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, and also of TikTok. We also do share data when we have relevant data with X and also with Google. Through our trusted partnership program, we were able to action and remove well over 50,000 pieces of content during the October 7th attacks and also in the weeks following. And we have seen an increase in the rates of removal when online anti-Semitism is reported to the social media platforms. That average went up from when we started working in 2022 was only at about 25% average rate of removal. And when we shifted into 2023, we saw overall that that number has increased to an average rate of removal of 32% by social media platforms when anti-Semitism is reported. So we do see that social media platforms, especially after the October 7th attacks and the wave of online anti-Semitism, are aware that online anti-Semitism is a problem. And we do see a new kind of readiness to invest more in terms of content moderation and, more importantly, automatic removal of online anti-Semitism, but there's still a long way to go.
Now, Israel suffered a horrific genocidal terror attack on October the 7th. Are anti-Semites also using sexual violence? Are we seeing a denial there in the sexual violence that took place on October the 7th?
Yes, absolutely. So that was the other thing that Cyberwall tracked very clearly. Not only this real serious wave of online anti-Semitism post October 7th in our social media platforms, but a very clear campaign that was focused on October 7th denial. The number one sub-narrative, we did a deep dive analysis of the October 7th denial campaign that started as early as October 8th, mind you, 10th and 11th, so very early days. Immediately after this heinous attack, there was a very clear online attempt to say that has never happened, that this is a hoax, that this is a conspiracy theory, very much mirroring what you would call Holocaust revisionism or Holocaust denial. Out of the vetted data set that Cyberwell took a look at, which in the initial days was roughly a small data set of 313 examples, the number one sub-narrative, about 39% of the denial sub-narrative online, was there was no rape or there was no sexual violence. That was the most popular form of denial online today when it comes to October 7th denial. A second sub-narrative, and that is that Israel is actually behind the October 7th attacks, that they are somehow the ones who are the architecture of this horrific attack, and about 5% of the denial narrative saying that Israel actually profits from the October 7th massacre. So if you look at these sub-narratives in the larger October 7th denial campaign, you can really see that the purpose of the October 7th denial campaign is to bring the believer of this conspiracy theory through every station of anti-Semitic belief. So number one, you would be saying that October 7th never happened. The subtext in that is that Jewish life, or more importantly, Jewish death, is irrelevant and not important. Number two, that the Jews or the Israeli establishment are all lying about October 7th. And then naturally, if you believe that, then you would say, okay, if it's a lie, then how is it that everyone is talking about this across the world? Oh, it's because Israel and the Jews actually control the media or control the world, and they have an interest in making you speak about this lie because they're actually benefiting from the entire hoax that is October 7th. And this is very similar to the framework of anti-Semitic belief that is perpetuated by the Holocaust denial movement that reached its peak in the late 80s, early 90s. But the difference is now that this October 7th denial narrative is being platformed for millions of people by social media platforms. And despite the fact that there is precedent in the digital policies of the platforms themselves, this content is not being removed. I mentioned earlier that the average rate of removal for reported anti-Semitism online, when you report it to a platform yourself, is about 32%. When we reported this denial narrative in the vetted examples that we were tracking at Cyberwell, we saw that the average rate of removal sat at just about 9%, so significantly lower than the average rate of removal. We are seeing a real hesitance by the platforms to remove this content, with the lowest rate of removal specifically for the rape denial content being on Instagram, which removed 0%, meaning didn't remove any of the rape and sexual violence denial content that Cyberwell reported to it.
Have you heard some of the terrible stories from these women who went through some of these events of rape and murder, basically?
Yes, absolutely. As we've been following the denial campaign, so too we've been following the verified information and the recent testimony of Amitsu Sana that came out, detailing in graphic detail what happened to her. And she is one of many women and many corpses of victims of the Hamas terror attacks that were found, and that the bodies of those women, and also of men, by the way, told their own story. And I think in the beginning, as we were tracking the October 7th denial campaign online, there was some kind of openness to saying, well, this is the event as it is developing, and it's an emergent situation. There are new details coming out. But at this point, specifically when it comes to the issue of using rape and sexual violence as a tool of war, which Hamas and Gazan civilians who participated in the October 7th attacks undoubtedly did. And at this point, we have corroborated evidence both from established professionals in Israel who detailed the bodies of the women and men that they found that experienced sexual violence, who have spoken directly to victims. Even the United Nations has a report that is corroborating that rape and sexual violence were utilized by Hamas during the October 7th attacks as a tool of war. At this point, the fact that the social media platforms cannot come out and make a statement that this type of denial content is complete misinformation, disinformation, and it is prohibited by their digital policies is simply a really puzzling and I would say frustrating and deeply hurtful instance of double standards by the social media platforms. I want to just share a little bit about more what do I mean. So most social media platforms have digital policies specifically addressing this issue of violent event denial. This also applies to Holocaust denial, which is prohibited content by most of the social media platforms today. And in fact, it is one of the most effectively enforced forms of prohibited anti-Semitic content, meaning that Holocaust denial is actually very difficult to find online on these major platforms when you compare it to other forms of anti-Semitism. But it doesn't only extend to anti-Semitism, it also extends to the Sandy Hook school shooting, which was the largest school shooting in the United States history. You cannot deny that that event happened. Same thing with the Rwandan genocide. Same thing with the Christchurch shooting. You cannot say that these violent events that victimize so many people did not happen, because when you are saying that they didn't happen, you are actually doing so in order to, at the minimum, hurt the victims of this crime. So this is absolutely has a precedent for being prohibited content online, yet we're seeing with the social media platforms that they are refusing to take the same strong stance when it comes to October 7th denial, and specifically when it comes to the denial of the use of rape and sexual violence on that fateful day. And frankly, as a feminist, I can tell you, I think this reinforces rape culture everywhere.
We saw during the Holocaust that many victims of the Holocaust didn't speak out afterwards. They kept quiet about everything that had happened. Is the same thing happening here with October the 7th? And do women need to now come forward more and say, this is what happened to me?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the way that rape and sexual violence is weaponized against women and men, by the way, during war, it is normal in terms of just a regular trauma or the trauma that sexual violence and rape brings to a victim's life, that they take time to process it on their own. And then they gather the strength, or as part of their healing journey, they come in and they say, I want to talk about my story now. So this is absolutely true. We've seen it. It's very typical in terms of gathering testimonies from victims of rape and sexual violence in war situations, and particularly in war situations, as there is pandemonium and there's a lack of resources, a lack of attention, and a lack of ability to process. It's why the fact that Amit Susana recently came forward and shared her harrowing testimony of how she was treated by Hamas and raped in captivity was so important. That woman is an absolute hero. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it took 10 Hamas men over an hour to drag Amit across the border from her home in her kibbutz into Gaza. She was absolutely a fighter. I personally witnessed her video online as I was monitoring a lot of the more graphic content coming out during October 7th and the week of. And I will never forget her video, because I saw it and I thought, this woman is a fighter. She was one of the few women who went kicking and screaming and simply wouldn't let herself be dragged in there like an object. And I was so inspired by her then, and I'm even more inspired by her now. But the fact of the matter is that we are still learning the details of the harrowing events of October 7th in terms of sexual denial and rape. And I can only say, hopefully, that I pray that we'll be able to meet additional hostages and to hear what happened to them, because at this point, as you know, the situation seems very dire, and Hamas has said that they don't even have women to release at this point. But undoubtedly, we will continue to learn about the details of this nature. And I think that it's just important, again, when we look at the online spaces, to understand that what this means for victims to be able to have gone through what they have gone through, to survive, to tell the story, and then see a purposeful denial campaign that is gaining millions of views. I want to share with your listeners that in that initial data set of 313 verified pieces of October 7th denial online, that reached over 25 million views over the course of a few short weeks. So it means that this denial campaign or this conspiracy theory is being platformed for millions of users. It's not only that the denial exists in and of itself and how disgusting that is, it's the fact that it's gaining a tremendous amount of traction, and in some cases even being recommended by the algorithm for viewers online. That's how people will understand what happened in terms of this event, in terms of sexual violence and rape denial. In our verified data set, that specific sub-narrative reached way over 12 million views, close to over 15 million views. Yeah, 15 million views, 12 million of which are on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter.
We had the Me Too movement. Why isn't the world up in arms about this, defending the rights of women?
It's a fantastic question. There have been criticisms when it comes to feminism as a movement. Feminism has a very Western lens of looking at the world, that a lot of the Western kind of feminist movements, including the Me Too movement, wasn't only about sexual violence in the workplace, but was very workplace-based feminism, looking at the issue of equality, of pay, of women on the set. And it's important to remember about the Me Too movement, it is very much a Hollywood movement, right? It was very much about the critique of the way that films are made and the sexual violence that is built in there. But there absolutely is a double standard when it comes to the international legal world has acknowledged it only very recently, only in the past 30 and 40 years, that rape and sexual violence is a tool of war. And it is a crime against humanity when it's used on civilian populations. And as a feminist myself, I think it's extremely important not to get rid of that very important understanding, because this sexual violence and rape is kind of the ultimate form of violence that stays, again, with the victims of the civilian population, both men, women, and children, long after the attack itself. These are the scars and traumas that people carry in their psyche and their body long after the war itself. I think it's imperative for feminism and imperative for the safety of women and girls to continue to demand that there is outrage and accountability for the sexual violence and rape that did occur on October 7th, and unfortunately seems like is still being waged against the victims that are being held in captivity, the hostages, by Hamas. But I also think we need to look at the way that social media platforms are involved in reinforcing this rape culture by allowing the October 7th denial campaign to be platformed for millions of people. Essentially, what you are doing is normalizing rape culture and excusing rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war for millions of people who wouldn't know otherwise. That has a significant and lasting effect in terms of the way people are understanding this conflict, in terms of the information that people are getting, and definitely in terms of the safety of the victims of the rape and sexual violence themselves. So it's time that we don't only look in terms of the way that people are not responding, but we look at the social media platforms and their role in perpetuating this double standard. That's what Cyberwell is doing by continuously sharing data about October 7th denial online. We are working consistently with the social media platforms to get them to recognize that this should be considered a prohibited form of content online.
Which is the best social media platform in dealing with this?
When we look at sexual violence and rape denial of October 7th and the rates of removal, we can see that the rates of removal were highest on Facebook, which is a meta platform, at about 24%, and lowest on Instagram, which is also a meta platform, at about 0%, followed by X or Twitter at 1.5%. I will say that we have some initial cooperation or willingness to work on this issue of October 7th denial from Meta. Cyberwell is a trusted partner of both Meta and TikTok, which means that we're a nonprofit that does work directly with content moderators and the policy teams there. So we have seen willingness to discuss this issue from those platforms, and more information on that will be coming out later on. But in terms of not only rates of removal, but the traction, again, I can't overstate this enough. It's not the fact that this content exists online. It's the fact that this content is getting a lot of traction, that it's being platformed for millions of people. So if we look at the traction that this content is getting, out of the rape denial data set with 15 million views, 12 million of those views, over 12 million views, are coming from X or Twitter, followed by YouTube, which had a very small amount of examples in the data set, but already reached 1.4 million views, actually closer to 1.5 million views. So in terms of the rates of removal, we see that Facebook was most effective, Instagram was least effective, but the traction, the exposure that this content is getting is highest on X and on YouTube. So you can see each platform really has its own vulnerabilities and challenges around dealing with this type of content.
It's strange that Facebook would be one of the best, but Instagram would be one of the worst, and they're both owned by the same company.
Yes, that's indicative to you. So like Facebook and Instagram, this is maybe getting a little bit in the weeds, but it's absolutely true. Those two platforms operate essentially as separate companies. And while they are subject to the same community standards, we often see in our compliance work as Cyberwell, because that's really what Cyberwell is doing. We are acting as the online anti-Semitism compliance officer for these social media platforms. I should mention that all of the analysis that we do is not only monitoring online anti-Semitism, but looking specifically at how the digital policies are failing to be enforced by each piece of anti-Semitic content that we're flagging. So we see that despite the fact that Facebook and Instagram are ruled by the same community standards, Meta's community standards, that the enforcement actually doesn't look quite the same. But I do think we need to applaud platforms that are able to respond. And I think that we need to work within the digital policies on the books in order to get a policy that is meant to address October 7th denial online and remove this content at scale.
It's one of the big problems today when people go on social media, especially the young people. Do they take this information that they see as actual news and just believe that this is the news for today?
Absolutely. So social media platforms are being cited increasingly by social media users under 30 years old as major news sources. Typically, X or Twitter was highlighted by about 50%, over 50% of users who said that they use social media platforms as a news source under 30 years old. Twitter was highlighted as number one, but actually TikTok has been cited increasingly so in the last 2 years. Their numbers have doubled in terms of a social media platform that's reported by under 30-year-olds that it is being used as a news source. And when you look specifically at teenage use of social media platforms that are now reporting using social media platforms anywhere from 40 to 100 hours a week, it is undoubtedly true that these social media platforms are a major way that they're getting information and even their quote unquote news from their platforms of choice. If you stop anyone at a pro-Palestine or an anti-Israel rally, they will tell you that the October 7th attacks are propaganda, that they didn't actually happen that way, that the hostages and the posters of the hostages are propaganda, that they're not real, that Israel killed their own people. We literally see in the interviews of the anti-Israel protesters the very same October 7th denial content and sub-narratives that we've seen online. We're seeing them parroted by the people at these protests and rallies. So it's not surprising when this level of misinformation and disinformation, again, is being platformed for millions of people. Not only do they believe very much so that there's a genocide going on in Gaza, because that's what they're being told by their platforms online, but they also believe that the entire reason that Israel got involved in this war in the first place was because of a hoax, because of a conspiracy theory that never happened.
Do you have pro-Palestinian supporters? It's just their job to put negative content out there on the social media websites.
I don't want to comment on what the job of pro-Palestinian supporters are. I think that there are legitimate humanitarian concerns in terms of what is happening in Gaza. And I think that it's very difficult to get clear information. And I understand that people are genuine in their efforts to address the fact that there is a humanitarian crisis with humanitarian concerns in Gaza. But from that to going to promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic narratives, and even doing things like adapting Hamas's symbolism and emojis, and then promoting that as a tool of hostility against Jews online and offline, there is a very big difference. And I think that pretending like this camp is not involved in promoting radical anti-Semitism and violent anti-Semitism and certainly conspiracy theories is a little bit putting our heads in the sand. The evidence is suggesting that these accounts, in addition to trying to be a clarion call to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which I am not commenting on at this point, in addition to doing those things, are consistently using misinformation, disinformation, and promoting hostility against Jews online that eventually translates into anti-Semitism in the community.
Has it shocked you, the rise in anti-Semitism at the moment? And has it also shocked you when you see young people taking down posters of kidnapped people who were kidnapped in Gaza? Has that really shocked you?
Yeah, so I live in Israel. I'm originally American. And I very much was involved in monitoring the situation in terms of the attacks via the online space. Everything that I saw play out via social media platforms. I saw some of the most graphic material that I've seen in my entire life. And I think when we look at the numbers of the increase in 400% anti-Semitic incidents increase in the United States in the last year, and we look at the increase of 86% increase in online anti-Semitism that Cyberwell tracked, all of that, when we look at the numbers, doesn't shock me and doesn't bother me. But when I look at the human level of things like drawing swastikas on the pictures of the B-bus babies who were taken into hostility, or I see evidence of stickers being handed out at pro-Palestine rallies saying that rape is a way of resistance, or that babies are occupiers too. And again, as a feminist and somebody who's exposed to the graphic content that we saw on October 7th, to understand that people are willing at this point to justify and promote and even support and celebrate this level of barbarism on a human level, it is shocking. It is absolutely shocking. It's shocking from a Western perspective. It's shocking from a human perspective, from a feminist perspective. It's blood curdling and it is astounding. It's absolutely astounding. But I think people really need to recognize the power of online spaces. If you believe this information that you're having reinforced sometimes between 40 to 100 hours a week about not only Israel, but about the Jewish people and their role, quote unquote, in this entire episode of war and October 7th attacks, and you believe that they're behind these attacks and that they're using them as some kind of catalyst or reason to promote genocide, that is the only thing that can explain to me that level of brainwashing, how people could get to the point that they're supporting this level of barbarism. And it's important to understand that it doesn't only happen about Jews in Israel, right? If you look at the January 6th insurrection at the White House, that was a result of a conspiracy theory online being reinforced to millions of people in a very convincing way multiple times. People don't know this, but YouTube was the #1 platform that was cited by January 6th insurrectionists as where they got their information from, quote unquote. So the power of our social media platforms and online spaces really being a catalyst to move people into violent and unthinkable actions in terms of justifying and sometimes promoting violence, we really need to look at the role that our social media platforms are playing when we look at this phenomenon overall, if we want to address it effectively.
Why do you do what you do? And are you making a difference?
I started Cyberwell because I'm a student of history, and I know that the Holocaust against the Jews could not have happened unless anti-Semitism was first popularized as an idea. And before the Third Reich, anti-Semitism was popularized as an idea and as a brand, kind of in popular traditional media, in radio and television, even in academic journals and the intelligentsia. And when I did my work in the open source intelligence space, I saw this very clear migration of hardcore anti-Semitic thought and belief onto mainstream everyday social media platforms that are making up over half of the worldwide internet activity with about 4 billion users. So in my mind, the level of platforming of online anti-Semitism is what happened prior to the Third Reich on steroids. And I believe it is my duty and the duty of all of us to find solutions to this phenomenon. I think that the advantage and the brilliance of what Cyberwell is doing is that we're rooting our work in data and technology, which is then implementable at a scalable level, meaning we can take the high integrity data that we have at Cyberwell that looks at online anti-Semitism and specifically looking at it through the lens of the policies of the platforms themselves, and especially using things like generative AI, we can make that a compliance solution for addressing anti-Semitism in the digital era. But I cannot overstate how emergent this situation is. I think that people in a post-World War II world think that the Holocaust could never happen again, or a similar type of activity can't happen in a Western country. And because of social media and the power behind platforming this level of hate to millions of people, I would strongly urge people to look at this as an emergency situation because it is.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more?
People who would like to know more about Cyberwell, first of all, you can check out all of our data that we have verified, and you can actually be our partners in reporting that online anti-Semitism with your own social media accounts at app.cyberwell.org. It's an interactive database. You can filter according to your favorite platform or specific types of anti-Semitism that you're interested in reporting. Also, all of our research is publicly available at www.cyberwell.org in our report section. And in general, we have additional ways for you to follow us via our social media. We put out a lot of really great education content. So people who are looking to educate themselves, please feel free to follow us. And we look forward to people who are new to the community and interested to supporting us. Thank you.
Well, Tal Or, thank you very much for sharing today.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul.